When it comes to remodeling or renovating your home, there is a lot to know, and we have got you covered. This is Around the House.
Welcome to the Around the House show, the next generation of home improvement. I'm Eric G. Thanks for joining me today. This hour is brought to you by our friends at Monument Grills. Check them out at monumentgrills.com. Now, we had a request that came in asking about radon, and it's something that we haven't talked about in this show for a couple years, and they were right. We were missing something. And you know something? I brought in one of the leading experts out there, if not the leading expert in my opinion, and my friends in the industry. Dallas Jones, welcome to Around the House, brother.
Thanks for having me.
And you are one of the gurus out there because you have been doing this and really leading the charge with getting people to pay attention to this radioactive gas that nobody can see, smell, or just notice around their home.
Oh, it's been a long time. Yeah, I've been working in radon-related services and technology and businesses since about 1987. A lot of experience.
No kidding. And in Oregon, where I live here, for instance, and this is what really gets homeowners, and the show goes across the country, but in our area here, as part of a real estate sale, you have to have radon testing as part of the closing process. So that is it, which is cool. But the problem is we don't really have a great industry here. Nobody knows if it's good. Nobody can give any promises if it's going to work. And so homeowners, at least in my area, and this is where I think this came from, get very confused about what is radon, will a mitigation system work, and how do you know if it's working?
Mitigation systems do work, and but they have to be verified that they're working, and you can't just assume once they're installed they're going to work on and on year after year. Part of the issue is with a real estate transaction, we're limited to a very short time window. The home inspector and the buyer has a certain period that they're allowed to inspect the house, and so the radon test is just for 2 or 3 days typically. And while if it's done properly and it's done without any tampering or cheating on behalf of, say, a seller or an agent, then it can be a good test for that time period. But radon fluctuates from day to night, from season to season, and so you're just getting a very short time window for that test. If it comes back elevated, then you can be reasonably assured that it's a wise move to go ahead and get it mitigated. But if it doesn't come back elevated, you can't necessarily conclude that it isn't elevated other times of the year. It's good if you have the ability to monitor over a longer period.
Makes sense. Because, yeah, I popped in on real estate transactions when my house, when I was buying it back in 2019, walked in and I'm like, okay, this is not an exact science here. They had a bathroom fan had been left on accidentally, I think. I'm not putting anybody in there, but I'm like, okay, that could skew the test. So I turned it off. And you think about it, especially when you start getting into newer homes that have lots of ventilation, or new homes that have ERVs, HRVs, all these different things that are moving air around. It can be doing things like sucking up, creating a vacuum inside the house, or putting a pressure, which could always change that, it seems.
Yeah, it's the pressure relationship between the house and the soil that allows radon entry to begin with. So soil gases are typically drawn into the house because the air pressure inside is a little lower than it is in the ground. And so those gases are being sucked into any crack or crevice or hole or whatever to up into the living space. And that's made worse at certain times of day, depending on the temperature outside versus inside, certain times of year, depending on the same thing. Or we have warm weather, cold weather. What's the temperature difference between in and out? And then things like you mentioned, exhaust fans. So there's this stack effect that is pulling air up from below and exhausting it where it can at the top. And all of that can pull soil gases in. So with a mitigation system, what we're trying to do is reverse that airflow. So they typically install what's called an active soil depressurization system. Mm-hmm. And they suck air from underneath the house with a pipe. It's a PVC pipe typically, and an inline centrifugal fan. And it's pulling air out from underneath the building and creating a low pressure zone underneath the footprint. So that way, any cracks and openings that you can't see or get to, the air is moving from the house down rather than from the ground in. And if you can maintain that, then you've got a good system. The part of the issue with just assuming that a mitigation system is working is, let's say you have the test done in the spring or the fall when the weather's mild, and they come and do a mitigation. They put in the system, they do a short 2 or 3 day test after the installation, and it looks good for that time period. And that's because it's maintaining that lower pressure underneath during the time of the test. But then let's say cold weather, winter comes along and you start to turn on the heat and the temperature between inside and out is greater, then perhaps that system can be overwhelmed by the stack effect in the house. During that time of year, it may not be working so well. So it's really good to have the ability to continuously monitor. And the great thing is today there are devices out there that are very sophisticated and affordable for homeowners to have, that they can monitor their radon over time. Either whether it's before they have mitigation to see whether they need to take action at all, or whether it's after mitigation to make sure the system is working.
That makes sense. And that's a great idea, because let's say you put a system in and something happens and you get a crack on the other side of the house from the mitigation system in the concrete floor. Let's say something happens, you get a crack. Then all of a sudden, maybe that's not pulling all the way over there, because especially when things are retrofitted, many times they didn't plan for a mitigation system. So there's at best some gravel, hopefully, and concrete. I've seen them pour it right on dirt, and it's hard to create a vacuum when it's dirt on the concrete, right?
You have to be a little more conscious of how to create that vacuum when you don't have gravel. For example, I live in North Georgia, in the North Atlanta area. And a lot of the older houses are built on red clay, same kind of thing. And it's not very susceptible to airflow unless you find where you can get airflow. For example, around the footings at the perimeter, they dug out and then they backfilled to pour those footings. And oftentimes there'll be some settling underneath the slab over time. So then if you can put your suction points on along those walls where you can take advantage of that airspace, then you can extend that pressure field down to the opposite corners. Sometimes it takes multiple suction points in order to do that. But if you were to talk to people who tested during mitigation, I bet you could, tested during their real estate purchase when they bought their home, and they had a mitigation system put in. Or even if they didn't, they tested during that time, they tested after the mitigation, things came back looking good for that 2-day test, and they forget about radon. So I'm done with it. And it could be 20 years later, and they still think everything's just fine. And like you mentioned, there's so many things that can cause changes in the structure. Earthquake activity, blasting. Right? Oh yeah, blasting, because there's construction going on nearby and they're doing blasting. Or you have extended period of unusual drought, or you decide to put in a new heating and air conditioning system, which can have an impact. or
Sure.
you do some renovations.
Yeah, some pumps in the basement can change things, right?
Yeah, or you have to dig out because of the plumbing coming in from the street is old, and they have to replace it. So they trench and backfill, and maybe now there's a new entryway. So all those things can cause changes, and if you don't keep an eye on it, then you just never know.
So really, for most people, it's just smart to, if you've got a system, make sure that you have somebody coming out to maintain it and take a look at it. But really, self-testing seems to be the way to have it safe. Is there really a safe radon level? I know you should mitigate at this point, but is it like anything else that's bad? You probably shouldn't have any if you can get away with it.
It's difficult to not have any because there's a little background, radon concentration even outside. The reason it's not harmful outside is because it comes out of the soil and dilutes into the atmosphere rapidly, and so we're not breathing much of that at all. But when it can get into the house, it can build up to a level that we're breathing. And it's been demonstrated over and over again with not just minor studies, but lots of residential studies, not just in the United States, but all over the world, that it has a direct connection to increased risk of lung cancer. The 4 picocurie per liter action level here in the United States was not set because it was considered to be a safe point. It was years ago when EPA set that, it was considered to be an achievable concentration, that our mitigation technology could consistently reduce levels to below 4 picocuries per liter. But they'll tell you when they look at the epidemiology data that there's a sizable portion of these lung cancers that occur to exposures of less than 4 picocuries per liter. So any reduction in the concentration is reduction in risk. If you read the EPA guidance carefully, it'll say if you test your home and the concentrations on average are 4 picocuries per liter or higher, fix the home. If it's between 2 and 4 picocuries per liter, consider fixing the home. Yeah, if you're a home buyer and you're negotiating with the seller, and the concentrations are between 2 and 4, you may not be able to negotiate having them mitigate the house at their expense, but you may really want to take a look at it over a longer period of time and see whether you want to go ahead and mitigate it for the health and well-being of your family.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Because really, that should be probably your next renovation on your brand new house, is just making sure that it's safe, because that's
absolutely
a big deal. And in my area here across the country, it's always interesting when I watch some of the maps out there, and I'm not going to name any ones, but I see ones that are, this is red, this is orange, this is yellow. And in my area, I'm between the orange and red, depending, and it's county by county, which doesn't really tell you much, but at least it says, hey, you should be testing in this area. But really, everywhere you run a risk, don't you? At least that's my opinion. I'm curious to see what your professional opinion is.
Yeah, that's a good point, Eric. The EPA zone map, for example, came out in 1992, and it's still out there for everybody to look at. Unfortunately, they didn't have a lot of radon test data at the time. So they used an algorithm that included a lot of factors, not just radon data. It included housing types. It included aerial radiation mapping, like the military does when they just fly over and measure the radiation coming off the ground. It included multiple factors that they put into this formula to help predict where it would be most likely to have elevated radon concentrations. Over time, now that we have so much more radon data than they did in 1992, we've discovered that they did a reasonable job with the information they had, but there are exceptions. And even with that map, if you look at the fine print at the bottom, it says that the map was not intended for you to decide whether or not you should test. It was intended to help focus resources to the areas of most concern first, and then work their way down. One of the things that's happened in recent years, starting in around housing and urban development, and began to require radon testing in multifamily properties that were being financed through FHA, a mortgage program. And they did away with the zone map distinctions and said, okay, we need to do this anywhere because an elevated concentration could show up. And there are states that, if you look at that map, are not red and orange. They're more of that yellow area, like Texas and California. And yet now they've been testing these multifamily projects. And guess what? They're finding radon in Texas and California. So it's real easy to say there's no radon in certain areas when there are no tests going on. Once you start testing, you find buildings and residences that are elevated. So the only way to know is to test.
Yeah. Just a year ago here in my metro area here in the Portland metro area, we had a fire department that had to close because of extreme radon that was in the fire department. Because they
and there was a prison up in the Northeast that they discovered that all the inmates were on the ground level were getting exposed to some very high concentrations of radon. So the more you look for it, the more you're going to find. The good news is it's easy and for the most part and fairly inexpensive to mitigate. Mm-hmm. And as long as you mitigate and then keep an eye on that mitigation to make sure it continues to work, then that's the health concerns that you just don't need to worry about anymore. You've got it under control and you're keeping an eye on it. In some areas of the country, it could be that way. Perhaps in Oregon, I know it's that way here in the Southeast. We've got a humid climate in the summer, for example, and a lot of lower levels, whether it's a basement or over a crawl space or even slab on grade. You're getting moisture coming in from the soil as well, that can contribute to that indoor humidity. And the soil depressurization systems not only can keep the radon from entering, they'll keep that moisture and other soil gases from entering the home. The technology that we use for radon mitigation is being used all over the country now, actually all over the world, for vapor intrusion mitigation, for chemical vapors. It's the same exact technology. They're putting it in large buildings from the very beginning when they construct them on these sites that were perhaps they were gas stations at one time, or they manufactured various things. Just right up from me, there's an old General Motors assembly plant that sat empty for a long time because they didn't know they could build anything on it because it was such a contaminated site. They finally cleared everything off and they installed the soil depressurization systems in all the buildings to prevent vapors from coming in. And now it's become a large movie studio set.
All right, I know which one you're talking about. Yeah, very cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's amazing. And I'm seeing that more. And I wish we could get the new construction building community out there to think about prepping the ground before they pour that slab on grade. I watch in Phoenix, for instance. I had a buddy that I worked with in the radio industry. He built a house down there and concrete's pouring and the truck's there and they're pouring right over the top of the desert earth. And it's just what they do there. That is the common practice. But in my head, I'm going, it's going to be pretty tough to mitigate that because it's a slab on grade and just a mono pour. And I'm like, that's really not going to give you a lot of options if you had an issue down the road.
There was a time when we thought that the best thing to do was to put gravel underneath the slab, and that's still a great idea. And to make sure that you've got some connection between any footings from one section to the next, where you can draw air across the footprint with your suction. There are sites where they're putting these systems in and then they're testing the building after. And if they need to, then they activate the systems by putting inline fans and all that's good. But they also have a vapor matting which is sandwiched together where it allows air to be drawn through it. And they can put that down as well in areas where perhaps gravel isn't as readily available. And they can roll this out and do the same sort of thing. So it's all very doable. And you're right, it's frustrating sometimes that it's just not a matter of practice everywhere. But the building codes, I was the executive director of the American Association of Radon Scientists and Technologists for a number of years. And we were really working, trying to get the building codes updated and accepted across the country to include this kind of process. But it's a slow process. You get little wins, and you're grateful for when you get a win. So it's now, there is an opportunity, but it's not a requirement. And that's the problem.
Would it be as simple as just putting in a massive glued together sheet of vapor barrier that would not allow that through underneath it?
That was tried actually years ago. And the problem is by trying to put that in, and then you have the workers there putting their
walking across
it, and they're walking across it and doing all the things they do. You just can't keep the integrity of that barrier. Try as you may, it sounds good on paper, but reads well on paper, sounds good in conversation, but it just doesn't work in practice. Yeah.
That makes sense. I want to shift over because I've seen this happen. I'm not sure how common it is, but I've seen people that have wells that have radon in their water. Is that something that you deal with a lot?
Yeah, it's not as common. Obviously, there aren't as many people across the country that have their drinking water sources from a well. But if you're on a private well, there's certainly the potential. The radon can become somewhat soluble in the water, and then you bring the water in from the well, and then it aerates. So as you're taking a shower or you're washing dishes or washing clothes, whatever, then the gas comes out. And if you were monitoring that, you could see no water usage, radon concentrations might be low. And then, now the laundry starts and the radon spikes up real high, and then it takes a while to come back down. Yeah, take a shower, same sort of thing. So it's certainly something that it has to be dealt with in a lot of areas. I know a lot of mitigators deal with that up in the Northeast part of the United States, but that's not the only place.
Yeah.
It can show up anywhere. So if you're on a private well, then it's really good to also be conscious that if you test for radon in air, you should do that first. If you find an elevated concentration there, then you should also check out your water. I guess the exception to that is if you're testing the house for radon in air and no one's living there and they're not using the water, then you would miss the well.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. If there's no real life stuff going on, then that could be a problem. Makes sense.
Yeah.
So I had that same listener, Beth, who wrote in. She'd asked about it. Is it common that you see out there that radon companies don't guarantee that they can reduce the radon level by putting in a mitigation system? Is that something common? I don't want to get into the he said, she said, and bashing contract, but I know that's a concern for people.
Yeah, I would say to homeowners to be sure and read contracts and make sure you ask that question. Just what are you going to do? What is the deliverable for what I'm paying you? And there will be situations, perhaps, I'll give you an example. Let's say the house is multiple foundation type. You have a basement section, you have an adjacent crawl space, and maybe even a little slab on grade area. Then perhaps the mitigator will give you a quote on doing the work that would address that basement and not address the crawl space or the adjacent slab, and not guarantee. And say, let's see whether this works or not. If it doesn't work, then we need to move to phase 2 and 3. So that can happen.
Sure.
But there are, unfortunately, like any business, there are contractors that even on a relatively simple mitigation may not guarantee. So I would always ask up front. Yes.
That's when you start asking questions, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Questions. I love talking with you about this because I'm learning a lot here too, which means everybody out in the audience is learning as well. What do you think about, there's been a big trend now with people worried about healthy air, which is great. That's probably the good thing that came out of the whole COVID thing, is people started paying attention to what they're breathing, and hats off for us learning something out of that. But I'm seeing more encapsulated crawl spaces and things like that. How does that affect radon if it's done correctly? And there's a big asterisk there, right?
Yeah, let me answer that in two ways. First of all, the encapsulated crawl spaces, that is part of a radon mitigation system for a house that's on an earth crawl space.
Okay.
But if you don't depressurize underneath that barrier that you put down, then there is no way to completely make that house sealed from the soil, regardless of how pretty it looks. There is basically radon is going to build up underneath that barrier and find somehow to come in at higher concentrations and be drawn up into the living space above. So more and more of the crawl space encapsulation companies are incorporating radon mitigation into their systems. The best way to do that is, if you want to have a crawl space encapsulated, test your home for radon first, and then make sure that they go ahead and address the radon while they're encapsulating the crawl space. It will make the air quality in your house so much better and address the radon at the same time. In the Southeast, and I know it's in other places, a lot of times the air handlers and the ductwork are down in that nasty crawl space.
Yep.
And there's all sorts of opportunities for mold and other contaminants to be, that moisture, and to be drawn up into the living area. So I encourage people to do that. But there are encapsulation companies out there who have not been trained on radon and don't think about it and don't want to get into the extra. We need to test first before we come out and make sure whether to include that. So ask those questions. One other thing you reminded me of, that when we were talking about builders, a lot of times there are jurisdictions where they require, I like to call it radon ready new construction features. Originally, they called them radon resistant, which is basically what you were talking about, putting the gravel bed and maybe a well point with a suction pipe that can come up, but they don't have a fan. And so the builders will advertise, oh, we took radon measures in the construction. But people are misled into thinking they don't need to test. You need to make sure that regardless of what the builder tells you about what they've done to resist radon in the construction, that you test before you purchase, where you will know whether you need to activate that fan or activate that system. And unfortunately, there's no requirement that the builder have any training on how they put in that skeletal system. There are situations where when the mitigator comes out to activate the fan, if they've tested, that they have to abandon the pipe because it just wasn't installed in a way where they can use it. So then they need to tap into a different place. So the whole idea is to make it less expensive to fix. It's not going to necessarily prevent any radon from entering.
Good. That is just so important right there. And to be honest, if the builder is on their game and they're at least doing that, which hats off to the builder for making that first step. But that also tells you that enough people have probably brought this up in the area that it's already a concern. So there's your first warning light of, hey, take it seriously, because the builder's going, hey, we got to take this seriously by at least prepping it, because we've got a lot of people asking about it, which is awesome.
Yeah. Yes.
So that's cool. All right, man, I'm learning so much with this because it's just such an evolving science. And it's one of those things that you jump online, and this is one of the things, and I laugh and almost cry at the same time, but we'll do a radon episode. The last one we did probably 3 or 4 years ago, where I had some people in and talking about it, and the hate mail I got, which I don't care, but this is fake science. And you know the story. You probably run into that every day, but I was just like,
yes.
Oh, great. We got flat earthers commenting on science again. Awesome.
Yeah, it is frustrating when you have an opportunity to meet people and I meet them every week almost, find out about them, hear about them, or get a chance to actually talk to them, who have lung cancer, who never smoked, who are often quite young, and they're asking the question, how did I get lung cancer? I stayed away from cigarettes. I wasn't around secondhand smoke. What happened? And they're curious. They want to know. They, even though they're in that situation, they want to find out, is my family at risk? What my children, my parents? And they began to test the house they grew up in, if they still have access, or the house they're living in, and they start to put things together. If you talk to oncologists who deal with lung cancer, they'll tell you this is real stuff. So I hope that we're moving past that point, that this is all nonsense. It's easy to disregard, or because you can't see it and taste it and smell it, but it's there. It's radiation, and that radiation can definitely do harm to your lung cells.
There is a story over on the American Lung Association page. These people lived half mile from me. And they did exactly that. I remember reading the news story. So I might have the numbers off here wrong, guys, because it's been a number of years since I've looked at it. But I believe he was 45, died from stage 4 lung cancer, had never smoked a day in his life. And if I remember right, and there's an asterisk here, I thought the number was like 10 or 12 in the house. And we have had more than one couple here in my neighborhood that have died from it. So it's very real. It's happened down the street. And what I think is interesting too, is depending on how the house was built, you can go down the house and test all the way down the street, and you can get 12 houses and 12 readings.
Oh, very different. Yes. You can have a house that's extremely high and 2 houses that are very low, and then another house that's high. The other thing on new houses, there are those houses now that have perhaps additional mechanical ventilation with or HRVs, but there are also a lot of new construction where they made the house very tight for, as far as insulation and air sealing, for energy efficiency, but they didn't add in mechanical ventilation. They're out there, a lot of them. And as we've made our houses tighter, then we're continuing to build houses with radon problems at a higher rate than we can mitigate. It's an ongoing problem.
And I see some issues in parts of the country, and I've noticed this to go back for a second on the crawl space encapsulation companies. Here in my area, the tendency is they put in, to control humidity down there, they'll put a dehumidifier in. But I have seen in other parts of the country where it's really common for them to go, oh, I'm just going to add another duct down here. And that way we get the air movement, so we don't have the stale air. And we're just going to add, we already got the ducts here anyway. We're just going to have an HVAC person in, put a duct and a return air down here real quick because it's already in the place. We'll get it so that's swapping the air out. It's just going to be a conditioned space. But in my mind, I go, if you're not dealing with radon, you're just injecting that right into the freeway, into your house, if you're doing it that way.
Particularly if you've got supplies and returns, if you've got a return in the crawl space and that return is leaky in any way, then every time it's drawing air back to the furnace, it's drawing air from the crawl space through whatever leaks in that ductwork. And so you could very well do that and see the radon concentrations go up in the living area. Yeah. For years I did training for energy efficiency and building performance. And the saying that they start out in Building Performance 101 is the house is a system. Everything is interrelated. So you go in and do one thing, and if you're not thinking about what does this one thing do to the other systems in the house, then you could end up causing more problems than you're solving. So you have to think of the whole picture.
And that's why they call it building science these days, because it is a science that is evolving. If you look how far we've come from 1982 with still using a lot of tar paper and siding to all of these multi-layers and rain screens and all the things that we put on the outside of the home, And all the systems we put inside, it seemed like some of the most unhealthy homes we built were in the 80s and 90s when we started to get it, but didn't really understand that, like you just said, that cause and effect. And now we're just starting to get that shipwrighted again with these new homes.
Yes. Yes. So hopefully, as we move forward, communities are beginning to take radon more seriously. There are jurisdictions where they are requiring builders to put in resistant new construction for radon, but there's still a lot of education to do. The good news is also we have the ability now to monitor our homes affordably. You can go to our website or to Amazon and you can find radon monitors that you can purchase and track the radon in your home and keep an eye on it. They're good to have because not only can they give you peace of mind, they can certainly alert you to what's happening. I had a conversation with a homeowner in Utah when it first turned cold weather this fall, and she had a radon test done when she purchased the home, and the concentrations were just under 4, so it was about 3.7, something like that. But she purchased one of our continuous monitors, and she was watching it go up every night after she started to use the heat, and it would get up to about 9 picocuries per liter at night.
Ooh,
and then
big.
in the day, she would go to work and it would go on economizer setback, and it would fall down to around 2 and stay low until she came home. And when the heat would start to run after she came home, it would rise up. So she showed this, sent me the data from her monitor, and it was just every night. And so her average could very well have been just under 4. But when it was low, she was at work. Yeah. When it was high, she was home sleeping in her bed.
She was on the wrong side of that average.
Oh. Exactly.
Okay, so I'm going to go to get 8 hours sleep, and I'm going to have 9 then. And when I brush my teeth in the morning and jump in the car, it's at 2.
Yeah.
That's not good. That's not good. So guess what I'm doing after this episode here? I'm going on and get I have air quality. Full honesty, guys, I have air quality monitors in my house. I can tell you what my PM 2.5 is. I can tell you what my humidity is and what all this other stuff is. Carbon dioxide, no radon. I got to fix that. There's my hole in the shield right now that I need to take a look at. And I don't have a system in my house because we were under 2 when I did mine. So I went, all right, that was pretty good. So, but I look out every day when I walk out the door. I look at my neighbor's system on the side of their house. So it's pay attention to that. Need to pay attention to that. So if people don't want to put their own monitors in, they're just like, hey, I want to have a pro do it and I'm going to forget about it because I'm not a techie person. When should they be, how often should they be retesting to make sure whether they have a system or not? What would you recommend?
The EPA says that if you tested and it was below the action level, you should retest every 5 years. Now, if you have a mitigation system, they say you should retest every 2 years. That said, when that recommendation was made, the only logical way for a homeowner to test, or affordable way for a homeowner to test, would be with a passive time integrating device like a charcoal canister, perhaps an alpha track device that they could leave out for 3 months or more. But they just give you a 1 number average. They're not going to give you the ups and downs that I just described. It is so affordable. For example, we've got units that you can purchase that you can track hourly data as well as the day, week, month, and year. And they're $50 or
wow. So it's cheaper than having somebody come out and do it. You can buy the machine.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Leave it there. So you don't even have to have the pro come out and do it.
Exactly.
Take snapshots. Wow, that's a no-brainer to me.
Exactly.
And guys, I want to warn something here too, and I'm gonna put my flag on this one. Be careful what you buy on Amazon, because oh my gosh. I tell you what, for my TV show, I did a thing called Let's Test It. So I jumped on and went, I'm gonna buy a portable carbon monoxide detector. And I went around and said, okay, wow, 000. I went in front of my diesel SUV and held it in front of the exhaust on it, and it showed 0.
Wow.
I'm like, that's broken.
Yes, that's a very good point, Eric. Unfortunately, with our company, we make professional devices and homeowner devices that have been evaluated, and I'm proud of the products we sell. But there are units that have been copied in China that look very similar to ours, and we're not the only reputable company out, but there's some out there that you could purchase, and they haven't been evaluated. They may have reverse engineered something, but they've missed some really key components or factors that make a difference. And there's no regulation on them. So yes, you do need to be careful.
Every good product that I have tested out there that was the first one, whether it's a vise, whether it's a knife sharpening tool, and if it's $200 for that thing, if you jump over 6 months later on Amazon, there is an exact copy of it for $39.99. And I know the owners of these things because they were the inventors that came on my show, and the raw materials to make it were twice what they're selling it for, which tells you someone's still got to make money. So it's not the same. So
not the same.
Very careful. That is like going into the swap meet and buying knockoff clothing parts there. You got to be really careful what you buy.
Yes, exactly.
So Dallas, what have we missed today? I know we got to wrap up. We have burned through an hour of the show here. What did we miss? And of course, we want to make sure how to find you, because there's a lot of people out there that probably want to buy some of these so they can be watching their own home.
I think the important thing is remember that radon is a radioactive gas. It's real. It's important to pay attention to it. I say it's also important to keep an eye on it, and rather than just test once and then think you're done. That would be the key messages I would like to make sure your listeners are taking away. My company is called EcoSense. Our website is ecosense.io. If you go to our website, we have devices that are for consumers, and we have devices that are for professionals. And if you go there, I can assure you that the sensors and the technology that we're using are very good. And I think once you get one and begin to keep an eye on your radon, you'll learn really the kinds of things, your activities and times of year, and what kind of things will cause your radon to go up and cause it to go down. And you'll have a much better understanding as to whether you need to take action, or you're more comfortable taking action, or whether you can feel real good that your home doesn't have that concern. For the price, I would say it's worth it. Lung cancer is ugly. So
yeah, that's the cheapest insurance against that type of lung cancer you can buy for $150.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That is awesome. Dallas Jones, thanks, man, for coming on today. I want to jump on again in the future so we can dive deeper into this as well. But thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to jump on and help educate everyone. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, I'm Eric G., and you've been listening to Around the House.